They tied her hands, left her in the desert, and rode away laughing. No name, no mercy, no second thoughts. But fate had other plans. He was a man with scars deeper than his silence, a wounded tracker who didn't speak unless the wind made him. And when he found her, half dead in the sand, he didn't ask who she was. He just carried her. This is the story of Clara Monroe, of what happens when the people they tried to bury refused to stay in the ground. She wasn't just saved, she rose. She didn't remember falling, only the heat, the white of the sky, and the sound of her own heartbeat drumming against her ribs like someone trying to break out from inside her. Clara Monroe had crawled until her elbows bled, her throat cracked, and the sun boiled her vision into flickering shadows. Somewhere between the canyon's jagged teeth and the burning flat of the basin, she'd whispered a name. Not her own, not God's, just please. That was hours ago, or days, or never. The last thing she saw was the wind picking up dust like a veil and something tall moving through it, slow, deliberate, then blackness. Reed Harlow had seen worse. He didn't flinch when he found her, didn't curse or pray or call out, just stood over her still form, boots quiet in the sand. Her dress was torn, her lips split, and her fingers clawed into the dirt like she'd tried to hold on to the world and lost. Buzzards circled wide overhead, knowing better than to come close with him around. He crouched, watched the slow rise of her chest, still breathing, still warm. He slipped his canteen from his belt, unscrewed the cap, and poured a trickle onto her lips. She coughed once, barely, enough. He didn't speak, just lifted her into his arms as if she weighed no more than a sack of grain and turned toward the ridge behind him. The sun had begun to dip by the time he reached his cabin, a two-room thing built into the edge of the hills, surrounded by nothing but rocks and silence. No one came out this far. That's why he stayed. He kicked open the door with one boot, moved to the cot, and laid her down gently. Then he went to the basin, filled it, found a rag, and began to clean her wounds. Still without a word, still without a name. The fever hit that night. She tossed and mumbled and wept in her sleep. Her limbs twitched. Her breath came in ragged pulls. Reed sat beside her, wetting her forehead, turning her gently when she threatened to choke on her own breath. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she'd been left out there. He'd seen enough of the world to know women weren't left in deserts by accident. By the third day, the color returned to her cheeks. On the fourth, she opened her eyes, pale green, sharp even through the fog of pain. They locked onto his face, and for a long moment, neither moved. Then she whispered, "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said. His voice was rough with disuse, deep and dry. "You found me." He didn't answer that. She tried to sit up and gasped, falling back with a wince. "Don't," he said. "Ribs are bruised." "Did you?" Her throat cracked. "Did you see anyone else?" "No one but you." She looked away. That told him everything. Later, when she could drink water on her own, she asked, "Why did you help me?" He didn't look up from where he was skinning a rabbit. "Wasn't planning on letting the buzzards win." "You don't even know me." "You were breathing. That was enough." She gave her name on the sixth day. Clara Monroe. He nodded, not offering his own. On the seventh, she asked for it. "Harlow," he said. "Reed Harlow." She blinked slowly. "The Reed Harlow?" He paused. "There more than one?" She stared at him. "My father used to say your name when he told stories. Said you once tracked a man 3 counties on a broken leg." "Your father from Boone County?" "Was. Died last year." He didn't press, neither did she. The quiet between them was no longer cold, just worn in, like old leather. On the 8th day, she tried to walk outside. The wind cut across the clearing like a blade, stirring dust and memory alike. She stepped out onto the porch, leaning heavily on the doorframe, and stared at the horizon. He joined her after a minute, standing a few feet away. "They left me," she said. Reed said nothing. "A man came to my uncle's ranch, said my brother owed him money, said if I couldn't pay it, I'd pay another way." Her jaw tightened. "They dragged me out past the flats, said they'd come back for me if they remembered, then rode off laughing." She didn't cry. He didn't offer comfort, but she saw something tighten in his eyes. a flicker of heat behind the calm. They thought I'd die. You didn't, he said simply. Number I didn't. She looked at him. But I will. He raised a brow. Not from thirst or fever, she said. From what's left behind. From what I saw. Reed's voice was low. Then take it back. That night he unrolled his old maps, laid them on the table, pointed to a spot between two dry rivers. Only one trail in or out of there, he said. If they've holed up, that's where they'd be. Clara studied it. You're going after them? I don't leave things undone. Even if they're not yours? He looked at her. They are now. She couldn't stop shaking when he said that. Not because of fear, but because for the first time since the desert, something solid returned to her chest. Something like hope. Clara didn't sleep much that night. The fire crackled low. The shadows moved in the corners of the cabin like old memories not ready to leave. She lay on the cot with her back to the wall, blanket pulled to her chin, eyes fixed on the dark outline of Reed sitting at the table, sharpening a blade with calm, measured strokes. She didn't know if it was his silence or his steadiness that unnerved her more, or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like prey under a man's roof. She felt like she could breathe, and that terrified her. By the 10th day, she was moving better. The bruises on her arms had turned yellow at the edges, and the swelling in her cheek had gone down. She still winced when she bent too fast or stood too long, but she was upright, walking, present. Reed started giving her tasks, chopping vegetables, stirring the stew pot, folding linens. She saw through the pretense. They were things he could easily do himself, but she accepted them anyway. It gave her a rhythm, a reason to move, a way to feel like herself again, or someone she might become. At night, she found herself watching him more. The way he sat, always facing the door. The way he cleaned his weapons like they were family heirlooms. The way he rarely looked her in the eye, but always knew when she needed a break, a drink, a moment. She wanted to ask him about his past, but didn't, not yet. On the 11th day, she found the trunk. It was beneath the bedroll in the second room, tucked in the corner behind stacked crates. She hadn't meant to pry. She'd been looking for cloth, but the latch had already been undone. Inside, an old revolver, a badge with the name worn smooth, a bundle of letters tied in leather string, and a photograph, a woman holding a child. Neither looked at the camera. They looked at each other. There was love in it, and loss. Clara closed the lid before Reed returned, but when he stepped inside a moment later, he paused mid-stride. You saw it? She didn't lie. I did. He nodded, not angry, just tired. Were they yours? He didn't answer right away. Then, they were. Once, I'm sorry. So was I. The next morning, she told him her whole story. She stood by the door while he stirred coffee and laid it out plain. Her father's death, the debts, the ranch taken by bankers, her brother's disappearance, her uncle's desperation, the man who came with slick hair and two white teeth, the ultimatum, the rope, the silence, the heat. She didn't cry. She didn't pause. She said it like peeling off a layer of skin. Slow, raw, but necessary. When she finished, Reed didn't offer pity. He simply said, You didn't die. She met his eyes. Not yet. That's something. Then he pushed a tin cup toward her. Drink. We leave tomorrow. They left before dawn. Clara wore one of Reed's spare coats, cinched at the waist, and carried the rifle she'd practiced with the last 3 days. Her hands still trembled when she held it, but her stance was firm, her jaw set. Reed rode ahead, leading the mule packed with supplies. Clara followed on foot, boots crunching soft over gravel. The sky was still violet when they crested the ridge and looked down on the basin where she'd nearly died. The wind shifted. She smelled smoke, a small campfire, barely visible behind a rise in the land. There, she said. Reed nodded. You sure? No, she whispered. But I remember that smell. He turned to her. You don't have to come the whole way. She stared at the camp, then back at him. Yes, I do. They camped in a dry wash a few hundred yards away, concealed by scrub and boulders. Reed laid out maps in the dirt, marking where he'd seen tracks, where he thought sentries might be placed. "They're not careful," he said. "That's good. Makes them predictable." Clara stared at the small pinprick of firelight in the distance. "They think I'm dead." "They're about to learn otherwise." She didn't smile, but her breath came steadier. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled above them, she sat beside Reed on the rock shelf. "You didn't ask me why I want to go back." He looked over. "Didn't have to." "I don't want revenge," she said. "Not exactly. I want proof." "Of what?" "That I wasn't weak. That I didn't deserve what happened." Reed didn't move. "You never did." Silence again. But this one was different. Warmer. She lay that night with her head inches from his, and when she closed her eyes, she didn't dream of sun or vultures or pain. She dreamed of fire, and hands pulling her from the edge, and a voice low and steady, saying her name like it mattered. They rode hard for half the day before Reed finally slowed. The land began to rise in slow, steady folds. Sagebrush gave way to clusters of pine, and the air shifted. It smelled less like dust and more like stone, like something older, quieter. Reed's cabin sat tucked against a rock outcropping high above the valley. You could ride right past it and never know it was there. That's why he built it there. Clara slid off the mule with a soft grunt, knees stiff from hours of riding. Her muscles burned, but she said nothing. Her hands shook slightly when she tied off the reins, but she kept her face calm. Reed noticed anyway. "Inside," he said, unlocking the front door. "Rest first, then we talk." She hesitated, then followed him in. The air inside was cool and still. The cabin smelled like cedar and old tobacco. Sparse furniture, a cot, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of worn books. On one wall, a rifle rack. On another, a single-frame drawing, charcoal, rough of a woman's face. Not beautiful, but warm. Clara stopped in front of it. "She was important," she said quietly. Reed's voice came from behind her. "She was my wife." She turned. "Was?" He didn't answer. She didn't press. That evening, Reed cleaned his guns while Clara cooked. She moved slower than she used to. Everything inside her still felt unstitched. But there was purpose in her hands now. Confidence, maybe. Or something trying to become confidence. The stew simmered over the fire. Rabbit and onion, wild herbs from the side trail. She stirred slowly, then tasted with the edge of a wooden spoon. "Needs salt." Reed handed her the pouch from the shelf without looking up. "You always this quiet?" she asked. "No." She waited. "I used to talk plenty," he said. "Didn't do much good." She set the spoon down. "Words matter, Reed." He nodded. "That's why I use them careful." They ate in silence, not uncomfortable, just thick with unspoken things. Clara watched the way he chewed, the way he always sat with his back to the wall, the way his eyes flicked toward the door every time the wind shifted. "You're still waiting for someone," she said after a long time. He didn't deny it. That night, Clara took the cot. Reed took the floor. He laid out his bedroll near the fireplace and stared at the ceiling as embers glowed against the stone. She turned toward him in the dark. "Reed?" "Yeah?" "You think it ever goes away? The feeling like you're still there?" He knew what she meant. The desert, the rope burns, the laughter fading into nothing. "No," he said, "but you stop flinching when it comes back." She closed her eyes. "Good." The next morning, he gave her a revolver. It was smaller than the rifle she'd practiced with. Clean, oiled, heavy for its size. Clara looked at it like it might bite. "I'm not ready," she said. "You are." He led her outside to a tree line behind the cabin, set up old bottles on a log. "Tight grip. Don't lock your elbows." She raised the weapon, missed the first 3, hit the 4th. The glass shattered and she flinched at the sound. He stepped beside her. "Again." She looked at him. "I don't want to be someone who kills." He didn't blink. "Then don't miss when it counts." Later, she found a trunk beneath the stairs. She knew better than to snoop, but something about the latch, half open, made it feel like an invitation. Inside, journals, a badge, a small hand-stitched baby blanket. She didn't touch any of it, just closed the lid and sat down beside it. She waited for him to say something when he walked in and saw her there. He didn't. He just lowered himself onto the stairs across from her. Her name was Ellie, he said. My daughter. Clara's throat tightened. What happened? Reed looked down at his hands. I wore a badge once. Town called Hollister Ridge. We had a sheriff. Old man. Good man. But he let certain folks get away with too much for too long. I made a mistake. Trusted a man I shouldn't have. Let him walk when I should have stopped him. His voice dropped. Next day, Ellie and her mother were gone. Fire took the house. Folks said it was an accident. He looked up at Clara. I never believed them. She didn't speak. She just reached across the space between them and set her hand over his. It wasn't comfort, it was understanding. That night they drank. Just a little. Reed poured half glasses of old rye from a bottle he hadn't touched in 3 winters. They sat on the porch, boots up on the rail, watching the stars wheel slow above the ridge. You still want to find them? He asked. Clara nodded. I don't know if I want to kill them, or just see their faces when they realize I'm still alive. Maybe both. She looked over. You think that makes me weak? No, he said. I think that makes you still standing. She lifted the glass. To standing. He clinked his against hers. To what comes after. She slept better that night. Deeper. And when she woke the next morning, she found a fresh saddle waiting outside. Reed was already packed, his coat dusted with pine needles. She stepped out into the cold morning light and looked at him. We riding? He nodded. They'll be looking to move. We need to be ahead of them. She pulled her coat tighter, and for the first time since the desert, she smiled. A real one. Not because she was ready, but because she wasn't alone. The road down from the ridge was narrow and winding. They rode single file, the morning wind stiff with cold and the scent of juniper. Clara kept her eyes forward, her hands tight on the reins, the revolver Reed had given her snug beneath her coat. She'd memorized the way it felt against her ribs. That weight had become familiar, comforting even. Reed rode ahead, silent as ever, his eyes scanning every slope and shadow. He didn't speak unless necessary, but every gesture had meaning. A nod meant duck. A flick of his hand meant stop. When he slowed, she slowed. When he turned, she followed. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. By midday, they reached the river bend where the old trading post once stood. Now it was little more than ruins. Charred beams, broken crates, a rusted horseshoe nailed to a sagging post. But Reed dismounted and tied his horse, so Clara did the same. What is this place? She asked. Used to be where travelers came through, Reed said, squatting near a patch of disturbed soil, before the Ward gang burned it. Clara's heart kicked. Ward? Edgar Ward. Runs with a crew now. 10, maybe 12 men. They've been crawling these parts the last year or two, taking what they want, leaving no witnesses. He looked up at her. You're not the first woman they left to die. Clara's jaw clenched. Then I won't be the last unless someone stops them. Reed stood. We will. They camped that night by a dry ravine. The stars were sharp above them, sky cloudless and black. Clara cleaned her revolver under the lantern light, fingers fumbling slightly as she reassembled the cylinder. You're getting better, Reed said from across the fire. I'm trying. That's more than most. She hesitated. Can I ask you something? He nodded. What happens after? He looked at her. After we find them. After I pull the trigger. What comes next? Reed poked the fire, sending sparks upward. That's the part no one talks about. They think the shooting is the hard part. It's not. It's the quiet afterward. Clara looked down at the gun in her hands. Maybe I don't want quiet, she said. Maybe I want a storm. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Then I'll stand beside you in it. The next day they found tracks, horse prints, 6, maybe 7 riders. A trail cut south along a canyon wall. Still fresh, Reed murmured. 2 days ahead, maybe less if they're stopping. Clara crouched near the tracks. One of the horses had a limp. She recognized the broken rhythm. They had that horse when they left me, she said. I remember hearing it drag. Thought I was imagining it. You weren't, she stood. They're not moving fast. No, Reed said. They think you're dead. They think the past won't come looking for them. She looked at him. They're wrong. They stopped at an old homestead that afternoon, a rotted fence, a windmill that turned once every 10 seconds, like it had forgotten how to spin. Inside the main house, they found a man, old, pale, shot in the leg. He looked up when they entered, coughing. Don't take nothing. I've already been cleaned out. Reed raised both hands. We're not here for that. Clara knelt beside him. Who did this? Men. 6 of them. One wore red. Asked if I'd seen a girl come through here. Clara's stomach twisted. A girl? Long brown hair. Said she was missing a debt. Sounded like they were hunting her. She stood. They know I'm alive. Reed's eyes narrowed. We've got less time than I thought. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat outside the lean-to they'd patched together, knees to her chest, watching the moon crawl across the sky. Reed came out after a while, wrapped in a blanket, carrying a tin cup of coffee. Can't rest? She shook her head. They're going to hurt someone else, she said. They'll find another girl, another ranch. I can't let that happen. You won't. She looked at him, really looked. You keep saying we, but this isn't your fight. He took a slow sip. It is now. Why? Reed hesitated then. Because I saw a woman once, back when I wore a badge. I let her go. Thought she was better off away from the trouble. A week later, I found her face down in a river. Clara's breath caught. I said never again. In the morning, they rode harder. No more pauses. No more small talk. The tracks turned east, then narrowed. By late afternoon, they reached a wide clearing with the remains of a campfire, still warm. A broken tin cup lay nearby, blood on the rim. Reed crouched low, studying the prints. Someone was dragged. Clara moved closer. How many? 9 men. One, smaller. Could be a hostage. She felt her hands clench into fists. They were doing it again. You sure? Reed nodded. Sure enough. She turned, facing the trail ahead. I'm not waiting for justice anymore. He stood beside her. I didn't bring you for justice. She met his eyes. You brought me for war. No, he said. I brought you to end it. That night, as they sat in silence, Clara took the charcoal from the fire and drew in the dirt. 10 circles, names beside each. Brett, Vance, Olin, Redcoat, Harker, Liam. She paused. How do you know their names? Reed asked. I don't, she said, so I give them one. She finished writing, then stood and ground her boot over each name. Tomorrow, she said, they don't get names anymore. Reed looked at her long and hard, then nodded, and the next morning they rode into the canyon, side by side. No more dust between them, no more fear, only resolve, only the weight of what they'd already survived, and what they were ready to face, together. The canyon narrowed just past midday. The sun beat down between high rock walls and the wind dropped away until it felt like they were riding inside a held breath. Reed slowed his horse and raised one hand. Clara stopped beside him, eyes scanning the ground. There, he murmured. She followed his gaze. Tracks, deep and erratic. 2 horses dragging something, or someone. Reed dismounted, crouched low, and brushed his fingers through the dust. Fresh. Not more than a few hours ahead. Clara's jaw tensed. Then we're close. Reed didn't respond. He just stood, checked his rifle, and handed her a small pouch of bullets. Load now. Don't wait until it's loud. Clara nodded. Her hands trembled only slightly this time. They found the first man just after the next bend. He was kneeling by a creek, filling a canteen, rifle propped against a boulder. Didn't hear their approach. Didn't expect anyone to come from behind. Reed signaled to Clara with 2 fingers. Wait. Then moved. He closed the distance in seconds, stepping quiet as shadow, and slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's skull before he could cry out. The man dropped, unconscious but breathing. Clara stared. You didn't kill him. He's not the one who tied the rope around your throat, Reed said flatly, but he knows who did. He turned, eyes sharp. You ready? She looked at the man, then back to Reed. Yes. That evening, they made camp high above the canyon floor. The trail split ahead. One path climbed into the hills, the other dipped toward a narrow basin. Smoke rose faintly from the lower trail. "They've stopped," Reed said. "Maybe for the night." Clara sat by the fire, legs tucked under her, sharpening the blade he'd given her 3 nights before. She was quieter than usual, focused. "You ever killed a man?" she asked without looking up. Reed took a long breath. "Yes." "Did it change you?" "Yes." She looked up. "Will it change me?" He met her eyes. "Number. It'll show you who you already are." Later, as the fire burned low and the stars crept out above them, Reed said, "You don't have to go in first." "I do," Clara replied. "You could stay back. I'll draw them out. We do this smart—" "No," she said firmly. "They left me to die. I want them to see my face before they fall." Reed nodded slowly. "Then I'll be beside you." Before dawn, Clara woke to the sound of wings, not far off, over the ridge. Buzzards. She stood, heart thudding, and scanned the slope. Reed was already up, scanning through the spyglass. "One body, maybe two." Clara stepped beside him. "The girl?" He shook his head. "Can't tell, but there's movement. Someone's still alive down there." She didn't hesitate. "I'm going." They approached on foot, quiet, careful, weapons ready. The camp sat in a hollow between two low hills, surrounded by boulders and brush. Reed counted 7 men, 1 on lookout, 3 asleep, 2 tending fire, 1 pacing near a tied figure. Clara stiffened. "It's her!" A girl, blonde, small, maybe 15, bound at the wrists and ankles, seated against a wagon wheel, dirty, bruised, but breathing. Reed studied Clara. "You want to wait for nightfall?" "No," she whispered. "We end it now." They crept closer. At 30 paces, Reed whispered, "Take the lookout." Clara raised the revolver. Her hand steadied. The man shifted, yawning. She fired. 1 clean shot. He dropped like a stone. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, scrambled for rifles. 2 tripped over bedrolls. 1 ran straight into Reed's barrel and fell backward with a hole in his chest. Clara moved toward the wagon, firing again. This time, a miss. The man beside the girl lunged at her, blade in hand. She didn't back away. She planted her feet, pulled the trigger. The shot hit him in the stomach. He screamed, dropped the knife, and fell to his knees. Clara stood over him, breathing hard. "Remember me?" she said. He looked up, eyes wide with horror. She fired again. The clearing went still, only the crackle of fire, the wind whispering through the brush. Reed emerged from behind the wagon, blood on his coat, rifle smoking. "We clear?" Clara nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes." He moved to the girl, cut her bonds. "It's all right," he said gently. "You're safe now." The girl looked up at Clara. "You're the one they left in the desert." Clara knelt beside her. "Not anymore." They buried the bodies in a shallow trench, didn't mark the graves, didn't say words, just covered them with dust and left them to silence. That night, Clara sat by the fire, hands shaking, not from fear but release. Reed handed her a flask. She took 1 sip, then another, then looked at him. "I thought I'd feel better." "You will." "When?" "When you stop waiting to." The girl's name was Ruthie. She barely spoke. Clara gave her her blanket, showed her how to cook the dried beans, let her sleep close by the fire. Reed said little, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching, not for threats, for healing. On the 3rd day, they reached the old trail fork again. Ruthie would go to May Colton's ranch, Clara decided. She'd already written the letter. Reed had offered to ride with her to ensure the girl made it safe. But Ruthie took Clara's hand that night and said, "I want to go where you go." Clara looked at Reed. He said nothing, but nodded once. That night, after Ruthie was asleep, Clara sat beside Reed on the porch of the abandoned homestead they'd taken shelter in. "You were right," she said. "About what?" "It didn't change me." He looked over. "No. Number, it reminded me I was never what they said I was. I was always this." He studied her face, her mouth, her hands, then said, "You're more." She swallowed hard. "I don't know where to go next." He leaned back. "I do." She looked out across the moonlit plain. "Then lead the way." The trail east of the canyon ran red with rust-colored clay. Even days after the fight, Clara could still smell the cordite in her coat. The gunshots no longer echoed in her ears, but they lingered in her bones, vibrations buried deep. Each hoofbeat on the dry trail was a reminder of the men they'd left in the dust. Ruthie rode in silence, her small frame dwarfed by the saddle. Reed had given her his old hat, and it shaded most of her face. She didn't cry, not once, but her eyes never rested. Clara understood. She remembered what it was like to live between blinks, how the world felt sharper after survival, and how safety felt suspicious. They camped that night beneath the ruins of an old way station. Just 3 stone walls and a chimney now, open to the stars. The fire crackled low as Ruthie fell asleep, her head resting in Clara's lap. Reed sat opposite, sharpening his knife on a whetstone with slow, practiced movements. Clara ran her fingers gently through Ruthie's hair. She hasn't said a word since yesterday. She doesn't need to, Reed said. Because you think silence is strength? No, he answered. Because sometimes silence is the only way to stay standing. Clara looked up at him. You would have let her come with us? I didn't have to decide. You already had. When Ruthie slept deeper, Reed stood and walked a few paces away. Clara followed without a word. They stood together under the open sky. You ever wonder if we're just dragging our pain with us? She asked. All the time, he said. She turned to him. Then why not stop? Because some things don't deserve peace. Not until they're buried properly. He reached into his coat and pulled out the badge he kept wrapped in cloth, held it up in the moonlight. I wore this thinking I knew what justice meant, that there were lines, rules, redemption. Then I broke all of it for the wrong man. He looked at her. You ever feel like the second chance you want doesn't want you? Clara stepped close. All the time. They stood like that for a long while. Close, not touching. Finally, Reed whispered, I used to think I was keeping everyone safe by staying away. And now, I think I'm just tired of being alone. They didn't kiss, but something between them broke open that night, quietly, irrevocably. The next morning, the decision was made. They would escort Ruthie to May Colton's ranch, where Clara had stayed once before. But they wouldn't stay there. Not long. Not while 2 names remained on Clara's mental list. Vance and Redcoat, the worst of them. The men who'd tied the rope. The men who'd laughed while she clawed at the sand. The ones who hadn't been at the canyon. Reed found their trail a mile south of Dust Creek. Boot prints, empty cans, a torn piece of red cloth snagged on a mesquite branch. They doubled back, he said, trying to vanish. They didn't expect anyone to be following, Clara added. He nodded. That's how men like that survive. They assume the broken don't get back up. She looked down at Ruthie, holding the reins to her borrowed mule. They're not ready for what we've become. 2 nights later, they found the first one. Vance. He'd holed up in a cabin north of the bluffs. Alone. Drinking. Scouting new ground for the next raid. Clara insisted on going in alone. Reed argued, then relented. He waited just outside. She walked through the open door like a ghost. Vance looked up, bleary-eyed, bottle in hand. At first, he didn't recognize her. Then the color drained from his face. Monroe, he croaked. Clara leveled the revolver. You don't get to say my name. Listen, I didn't. You did. I didn't know they'd leave you. But you tied the rope. His hands trembled. You don't have to do this. She stepped closer. Number, but I will. She fired once, then turned and walked out into the wind. Reed didn't speak when she returned. She didn't look back. They mounted and rode. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She paced along the ridge while Reed stood near the fire. I thought I'd feel relief, she said. You don't? Number, I feel done. He stepped beside her. Sometimes that's all justice is. She looked up at him, her voice softer now. Do you think we're too far gone to build something after this? Reed studied her face. No, he said. I think what we've already built is stronger than anything they tried to destroy. They returned Ruthie to May Colton's ranch the next morning. The older woman hugged Clara tight and didn't ask a single question, just held Ruthie's hand and led her inside. Before they left, Clara knelt beside the girl. You'll be safe here, and when you're ready, you'll speak. Don't let anyone rush you. Ruthie nodded, her chin wobbling. Then she threw her arms around Clara and squeezed. It was the first time Clara cried in front of Reed. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on her back and held it there until she was ready to walk again. One name left. Redcoat. Reed found his trail near the edge of Hollister Ridge. Clara recognized the town. It was the last place she'd been before the desert, where she was promised protection and got silence, where Reed once wore a badge, where his daughter's name was whispered behind church pews. They stood outside the gates at sundown. Reed looked over. "You sure?" Clara's eyes burned. "No," she said, "but I'm ready." Then they walked in, side by side, not for justice, not for revenge, but for something that lived between them now, something no one else had ever managed to give them, a future worth facing, together. Hollister Ridge looked smaller than Clara remembered. The town that once felt like a wall she could never scale now resembled nothing more than a worn-out gate on a forgotten trail. Buildings leaned inward like old men whispering secrets. Dust blew across the empty main street. A dog barked once from behind the blacksmith's stable. Then silence returned like a curtain falling. Reed sat beside her on horseback, eyes fixed on the saloon at the far end of town. "That's where he'll be," he said. Redcoat always liked making noise in places that served silence. Clara dismounted first. She didn't wait for fear. She didn't wait for Reed. She just walked. Inside the saloon, there were 6 men drinking and pretending not to stare. One leaned against the piano, one behind the bar, the rest scattered like ash. But Clara only saw one. The red coat was faded now, dust-caked, one arm torn at the seam, but the man wearing it still carried himself like he deserved a crowd. He looked up when the door swung open. He froze when he saw her. Clara stepped inside, boots echoing across the warped floorboards. "Been a long time," Redcoat said, smiling, though his face paled beneath the stubble. "Heard you'd gone missing." Clara stopped 10 feet from him. "I was left to die." He chuckled dryly. "Well, you seem to have done fine." Reed stepped in behind her then, slow, deliberate. His presence hit the room like thunder waiting to roll. Redcoat's smile faltered. "You two come for a drink? Or trouble?" Clara drew her revolver and set it on the nearest table. "I came to ask why." That silenced the room. Redcoat blinked. "Why? Why you laughed while I begged? Why you walked away and never looked back?" Redcoat's lips curled into a sneer. "Because you were nothing. A payment. A message. Something to be forgotten." Clara stepped closer. "Then remember this." Her hand moved faster than he could blink. The gunshot rang like judgment. Redcoat fell sideways, blood soaking into the floor. No screams. No protests. The men who'd watched said nothing, because they knew. Justice had just walked through their door. Outside, the sun was setting, the sky painted in fire and lavender. Reed stood beside her as she holstered the revolver. "You all right?" "No," Clara said, "but I'm clean." They didn't ride fast after that. They took the long road north, through the low hills and quiet valleys. They didn't talk much for the first 2 days. Words weren't necessary. At night, Reed would light the fire. Clara would cook. And sometimes, without meaning to, they'd find their hands meeting halfway in the dark. On the 4th night, under a sky full of stars, Clara finally said what she hadn't been able to since the desert. "Thank you." Reed looked at her. "For what?" "For seeing me when I was nothing but dust and blood." He shook his head gently. "You were never nothing." She looked down. "Maybe I needed to bleed to find what mattered." "You didn't," he said, "but you survived, and now you decide what comes next." She looked up. "I want land." He smiled faintly. "You've got land." "I want a home." "You've got that too." Then she said it, soft, sure. "I want you." He nodded once, stepped forward, and kissed her with the weight of everything they'd both carried. It wasn't perfect. It was real, and that made it more than enough. Months passed. The cabin was rebuilt. New beams, new stone, new roof. Clara planted roots, tomatoes, lettuce, 2 apple trees. Reed fixed the fence, took up hunting again. He started leaving his coat on the hook when he walked in the door. Some nights were quiet, some were hard, but they never had to survive them alone. And one spring morning, Clara stood at the edge of the ridge, hand resting over the gentle curve of her stomach, watching Reed repair the porch steps. He glanced up at her, wiping sweat from his brow. She smiled. "You know what name I want to give her?" He paused. "Her?" She nodded. "Ellie." He swallowed, his throat tight. Then he nodded. "I think she'd like that." And so the man who once lost everything found a reason to stay. And the woman left to die in the desert learned how to live again. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with firelight and a name spoken with love. They thought she'd die alone, but she built a life in the ashes, grew love where the world had scorched her, and gave her child the name of a girl Reed once lost, because now they had a chance to keep something alive. Clara didn't survive to get revenge. She survived to rebuild. And sometimes healing doesn't come with forgiveness. It comes with firelight, a second chance, and someone who stays. Let us know in the comments, would you have walked away or gone back to face the ones who left you behind? And what would you name the future if it was yours to choose? The stage rattled to a halt outside Red Bluff General Store, pulled by 4 tired horses and weeks of road dust. Loretta Hart stepped down slowly, her boots hitting the ground with more weight than they used to carry. She brushed the front of her traveling coat, though the dust clung like memory. She didn't look at the store right away. Instead, her hand drifted to the inside pocket, where the last letter rested, creased, worn, and soft at the edges. 5 years of words, 5 years of paper stitched with hope. He knew her favorite hymn, the way her mother hummed while canning peaches. He'd written once that her handwriting looked like wind through tall grass. She'd written back that maybe someday he'd see it in person. That someday was now. Loretta took a breath and walked to the door. The brass bell above it gave a tired ring. Inside, the air smelled of wood oil and old apples. Shelves leaned with jars and tobacco tins. And there behind the counter stood a man. He was taller than she expected, broader, and his eyes, steady, unreadable, were nothing like the ones she'd imagined for 5 years. Loretta Hart stepped into the store with a letter pressed tight against her chest and dust clinging to the hem of her skirt. The bell above the door gave a brittle jingle, and the smell of kerosene and tobacco leaf hung in the air like it hadn't moved in weeks. She paused just inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dim. Her heart was a steady drum beneath her coat. Shelves lined the room, cans, tools, bolts of cloth, jars of boiled peaches. Behind the counter stood a man with broad shoulders, a weathered face, and the kind of stillness that made you wonder how long he'd been that way. She knew his shape before she saw his face. It was him. It had to be. "Michael," she said, just above a whisper. The man looked up, slow and careful, as though the sound had startled something in him. He didn't smile, didn't blink. He simply said, "Who's asking?" She stepped forward, her boots creaking across the wood. "Loretta Hart, I wrote you." A long pause stretched between them like a tightrope. He shifted. "I remember." Something in his voice twisted her stomach. It wasn't that it was wrong. It was just different, like reading a familiar poem out loud and finding the rhythm off. "I came from Arkansas," she said gently. "I suppose that doesn't mean much, but 5 years of letters seemed like something." He nodded once. "I didn't expect you to come." Her fingers tightened around the letter. "You never said not to." He looked away. "That was my mistake." A cold breeze slipped in through the open door. Loretta swallowed hard. "You don't recognize me." His eyes lifted, steady but unreadable. "I never saw your face." She gave a tight nod, forcing a smile. "Fair enough. Still thought maybe you'd know me by the words, the voice behind them." Another silence. "I didn't think it would come to this," he said. "To what?" "Meeting." His hands gripped the edge of the counter. The words were meant to stay between the pages. Loretta blinked, heart sinking like a bucket dropped into a dry well. "I don't understand. I wrote to you. You wrote back. Every month. For 5 years. And now that I'm standing here—" "You shouldn't be here," he said, not unkindly but firm. She took a step back. "Why?" He hesitated, then let out a long breath, like he'd been holding it since the war. Because I'm not Michael Dane. The words landed like a pistol shot in a quiet church. Loretta's mouth went dry. What? He didn't flinch. Michael was a friend. We rode together in the 18th Infantry. He died outside Fort Carson. There wasn't much left of him when the shooting stopped. Just a satchel, a Bible, and a letter from you. She stared at him, unmoving. I read it, he said, over and over. I hadn't seen handwriting that soft in years. I started writing back. I didn't sign my name. I used his. Figured it wouldn't matter. Figured you'd write once, maybe twice. But I didn't, she whispered. He shook his head. Number U kept writing, and somewhere in the middle of all that, it stopped being pretend. Her voice was thin now. So you lied. I did. And everything you said, everything I told you, I never wrote anything I didn't mean. Loretta stepped back, the letter still crushed in her fingers. The general store felt too small now, the walls too close, the lanterns too dim. I thought I knew you, she said softly. You knew the best part of me, he answered. Maybe the only good part I had left. She turned toward the door. Loretta, he called, but she didn't stop, didn't turn. The bell rang again as she stepped outside into the dust and heat and noise of horses down the street. The paper in her hand felt heavy. She had crossed 3 counties for a man who had never existed, and the man who stood in his place didn't know what to do with the truth. Michael Dane, or whatever his real name was, didn't sleep that night. Not really. He sat on the edge of the cot in the back room of the store, lantern flickering low, the same letter he'd read 100 times now, resting in his lap. It was the one she'd tucked into her first envelope, before she knew anything about the world beyond Arkansas, before she knew what kind of man would write her back. He ran a callous thumb over her words. She'd written about her mother's biscuits, about the church bell that rang 5 minutes late every Sunday, about the boy who asked her to dance once and then joined the cavalry instead. She'd written without fear, without expectation, just a need to be heard, and he had answered. Every lie had started with a truth. That's how they worked best. He didn't hear her come in the next morning. She didn't knock, just stepped inside the store, boots brushing the wood, eyes hard and unreadable. You said your name wasn't Michael, she said. He didn't move. It's not. What is it then? He hesitated, then low. James Lorne. Loretta nodded once, slow and careful. James. The name didn't sit right in her mouth. I found a room at the boarding house, she said. Mrs. Avery says I can help out with the linens in exchange for 2 meals and a roof. James nodded. That's good. I'll be staying a while, she added. Figured you should know. He met her eyes. You don't owe me that. No, she said, but I owe it to myself. I didn't come all this way just to run. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words withered before they reached his mouth. Loretta turned to leave, then paused at the door. You kept every letter I sent. He nodded. They're in a box. I read them more than I should have. She didn't smile. I know what that's like. And then she was gone. James sat there long after she left, the lantern cold and empty beside him. Loretta worked hard at the boarding house. She scrubbed linens until her fingers wrinkled and her arms ached. But she liked the quiet, the rhythm. It was honest work, and it kept her mind busy when it wanted to wander toward the man behind the counter. James. It still didn't fit. Not yet. Some nights she walked past the store on her way home. The windows would be dark, but she swore she could see his shadow moving behind the shelves, like he was always awake, always searching for something he couldn't find. She didn't go inside again, not for a while. James tried not to watch for her, but he failed every day. When the church bell rang, he hoped she was inside. When the mail came, he hoped she'd written again. Foolish, maybe, but habits died hard, and he'd built 5 years of his life around the sound of her name. One afternoon, Elsie Myers came into the store for flour and noticed him staring out the front window like a man waiting for a train that wasn't coming. Some ghosts don't haunt you, you know, she said, placing her sack on the counter. Some of them sit on porches and wait to be let in. He looked at her. You think she's a ghost? Elsie shrugged. You look like a man who buried something. That's the look of someone surprised when it came back. He didn't argue. Didn't need to. Days passed. Then a week. Then Loretta returned to the store. Not for him, but for thread and a yard of plain muslin. James tried to keep his voice even. "You sewing something?" "Just patching what I have," she said. "Seems foolish to keep tearing through things when I could just fix them." He handed her the fabric. Their fingers brushed. "You don't have to stay here," he said quietly. "I know. There's nothing in Red Bluff worth hanging on to." She held his gaze. "There's nothing in Arkansas either. But I came here for someone I thought I knew, and I'd rather learn the truth than go home with a lie." James didn't answer, just watched as she placed her coins on the counter and left without another word. That night, he pulled down the box from the high shelf in the storeroom, the one with the letters. He opened it slowly, the paper worn soft with time. Her handwriting stared up at him like it had been waiting. He picked one at random and began to read. The words pulled him under, dragged him back to nights by the fire, to blood on his boots, to silence so deep it swallowed everything but ink. "I saw a bluebird today," she'd written. "It reminded me that not everything flies away forever." He closed the lid, heart pounding. He carried the box to the stove, opened the door, lit a match, held it, and didn't drop it. He couldn't. Instead, he sat down, placed the box at his feet, and let the match burn out in his hand. The next morning, Loretta found an envelope on the boarding house steps. No name, just a single sheet inside. His handwriting. One sentence. "If you want to know the real man, I'll be here after closing." She stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into her apron, and went to hang the wash. The shop was already closed when Loretta pushed the door open. The bell gave a soft chime like it knew better than to shout. Evening light stretched long across the floorboards, dust swirling in the gold. James stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hands still. He didn't look surprised to see her. Just, tired, like a man who'd been waiting without knowing what for. Loretta stepped inside without a word. Her eyes scanned the store like it was the first time, even though it wasn't. She saw the shelves, the oil lamp, the Whitman book still tucked under the counter. "You wrote me," she said at last. James nodded. "I did. Your words felt real. They were. But your name wasn't." "No," he said. "But everything else was. Every line, every pause. Every lie I told was wrapped in a truth I didn't know how else to share." Loretta leaned against the front counter. "Tell me the rest of it." He hesitated. She didn't move. So he spoke. "I was born James Lorne. My father died drunk. My mother tried not to follow him, but grief don't always obey." He looked down. "I enlisted at 17, lied about my age, lied about everything." He poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one toward her. "I met Michael Dane near the end. He had a kindness in him that didn't belong on a battlefield. He carried your first letter in his vest like a charm, wouldn't read it where anyone could see." James sipped. "The day he died, he gave me 2 things, a letter from you and his name. Said I'd live longer than him and that I'd know what to do with it." Loretta's voice came low. "And you thought pretending to be him was what he meant?" "I thought, maybe if someone like you thought I was worth writing to, I could become the kind of man he was." Silence stretched. "And did you?" she asked. "I tried," he said. "I still am." She studied him. "But you didn't stop." "No," he said, "because after a while I didn't know who I was anymore without your words. You gave me more truth than I'd ever earned, and I gave you a name that wasn't mine." Loretta's fingers wrapped around the mug, but she didn't drink. "Can I see them?" "The letters?" She nodded. He hesitated, then led her into the back room. The box was heavier than it looked. James set it gently on the small wooden table. Loretta sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "I read them more times than I can count," he said. "Sometimes they were the only words I heard for weeks." He lifted the lid. Inside, paper, yellowing at the edges, her handwriting everywhere. She reached for one, opened it. "I remember this," she whispered. "I wrote it when the river behind our house flooded. I'd lost 2 chickens and half my garden." James almost smiled. You made it sound like the end of the world. It was that year, she said, but you made me laugh about it. She reached for another, then paused. A small sealed envelope, thicker than the rest, faded. She looked at him. He frowned. I don't remember that one. She turned it over. It's addressed to me. His face shifted. That's Michael's handwriting. Loretta's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside were 4 pages, folded tight. She read in silence. James watched her face pale, then tighten, then fall. When she finally spoke, her voice was dust. He wrote me, before he died. James didn't move. He said you were beside him, that if I ever heard back, it might be you writing, that he gave you permission, but he told you to stop after the first letter. James looked down. He said you were good, but you weren't him, that pretending to be him would only break me later than sooner. Loretta folded the letter slowly, precisely. He trusted you. I know, James said. She stood. He rose with her. I should have told you, he said. Long before now. Her voice cracked. You buried him twice. James flinched. She looked around the room at the box, at the coffee cooling on the table. I love someone who never lived, she whispered, and now I don't even know what parts of you were real. He reached out. Loretta, she stepped back. I came here for something honest, she said. You made me believe in words again, and then you used them to lie. I was trying to be worthy of them. Then maybe you should have let me decide what worthy meant. The lantern popped. Loretta turned. She didn't take the letter with her. James stood still, her words echoing long after the door closed behind her. Outside, the wind picked up. Loretta walked down the main road with no real direction. Past the smithy, the church, the stables. Everything felt too quiet, like the town had heard everything and chose to say nothing. She didn't cry. Not yet. She found herself near the riverbank by sundown, sat on a flat rock and then stared at the water. It didn't ask her who she was or what she'd lost. She stayed until the stars came out, and when she rose, she left her boots muddy and her heart tired. There was no letter this time, no reply, no closing line, just silence. The first snow settled on Red Bluff like a secret, not a storm, not a warning, just a hush that softened roofs and quieted boots on the boardwalk. People started walking slower, talking less. Smoke rose thin from chimneys, and wood piles grew taller. It was the kind of cold that didn't bite, but lingered. Loretta watched the town shift from the upstairs window of the boarding house. The days no longer rushed her. She folded laundry in silence, baked bread in the early dark, and took long walks past places she used to avoid, like the general store on Main Street with its green-trimmed windows and lamp that still burned into evening. Sometimes she passed close enough to smell tobacco and pine oil, but she never stepped inside. James hadn't written, not since the letter he never meant to send, the one that said, "Your turn," in 2 quiet words. Loretta had read them once, then again, and then she'd tucked the notebook away like something too fragile to touch twice. She didn't burn it, didn't hide it, but she also didn't open it again. Instead, she began to watch. Not him. At least not directly. She watched what he did. James had never been loud, but now he was barely there. He patched fences on the Miller property, brought sacks of coal to the church steps before the preacher could ask. He helped fix a buckled porch beam behind Elsie Myers, and every Tuesday morning he stacked firewood outside the livery door like clockwork, the work of a man trying to matter without being seen. One afternoon, she saw him lift a wagon wheel out of a ditch, his shirt sleeves soaked from melting snow. He worked until the wagon moved again. The farmer never said thank you, but James didn't wait for one. Loretta kept walking. He kept not noticing. That night, she found herself sitting by her bedroom lamp with a pen in hand, staring at a blank scrap of paper. Not the notebook, just paper. She wanted to write something, not to James, but to someone. Maybe her mother, maybe herself. But the words stayed behind her teeth. She tore the paper in half and threw it in the stove before the ink dried. At church, people gave her space. No one asked about James anymore. The story had passed into that quiet place where Red Bluff kept its buried truths. Curtis nodded when he saw her. Elsie softened her tone when she spoke. Even Mrs. Avery, who'd once insisted on knowing every detail of everyone's life, brought her tea and didn't ask why Loretta sat by the window so long after dark. One evening, as Mrs. Avery laid the tea tray down and turned to leave, Loretta suddenly spoke. "Do you think people can lie without meaning to?" Mrs. Avery paused, surprised. "I think sometimes we lie because we want something to be true so badly, we start acting like it is." Loretta nodded slowly, eyes still on the street outside. What if someone built their whole life on a borrowed truth? Mrs. Avery didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Then they'll have to build again. From their own pieces this time." Loretta blinked hard. "I don't know if he has any left." Mrs. Avery gently touched her shoulder. "Then you give him one of yours. Just one. That's how rebuilding starts." She left without another word. Loretta didn't touch the tea. A week after the first snow, a letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't even sealed. Curtis brought it to the boarding house wrapped in a brown string. "He left this at the jail," he said. Didn't say a word, just handed it over and walked out. Loretta untied it slowly. It wasn't long. It wasn't poetic. Just James in his own hand, writing like a man who didn't expect forgiveness, only understanding. He didn't say he was sorry again. He didn't beg. He didn't explain. He wrote about the first time he read her letter by campfire light, how the night was so dark he had to hold the paper close to the flame, how her handwriting looked like music, how he hadn't planned to answer but something in her words made him want to be seen by someone, anyone, who didn't know what he'd done. He ended with, "I tried to become the man you believed in. I failed at the name, but not at the feeling." Loretta read it once, then again. Then she set it down and let it be. She didn't write back, but she opened the notebook, not to answer, just to begin. That Sunday, she left a fresh pie on the chapel table after service, wrapped it with care, no name. Monday morning, the pie tin was on the steps of the boarding house, washed, dried. Inside, a folded napkin with a pressed wildflower laid inside, brittle and pale blue, like it had been saved for a while. Loretta closed her eyes. She didn't smile, but she didn't cry either. That afternoon, she walked past the general store on her way to the river. James was sitting on the porch rail, sharpening a blade. He didn't stand, didn't speak, but he looked at her, just once. Long enough to see if she would look back. She didn't, not then. Instead, she kept walking, but her steps slowed. That night, she wrote 3 pages in the notebook. Not about forgiveness, not about grief, but about the sound the river made against the rocks and how the snow softened its voice, about how Red Bluff in winter smelled like pine smoke and black coffee, about how words used to come easy and now they came slow, but they came anyway. She left the notebook by the window. The next day it was gone. The first anyone noticed he was gone was when the general store didn't open at dawn. Curtis was the one who found the key still hanging behind the counter, untouched. The fire was cold in the stove, and there was a half-finished sack of oats on the back table, scoop still inside. James had left without packing, without locking up, without a word. He'd simply disappeared. Loretta found out by mid-morning. Mrs. Avery was the first to mention it, casually, as she poured tea. Strange thing. Store never opened today. Something in Loretta's hand stopped moving. She stared at the rim of her cup for a long while, then rose. Coat, gloves, boots. She didn't speak. She walked straight to Curtis. "Where'd he go?" she asked. The sheriff tipped his hat back and looked her square in the eye. "Didn't say, but I saw him ride out east before sunup. Took the back trail toward Harker Ridge." She didn't hesitate. "How far?" 2 days on foot, a day on a strong horse. "I'll borrow the pastor's." Curtis raised an eyebrow. "You sure you ought to?" Loretta's voice was low. "He left everything behind but his past. That means he's heading toward it." Curtis didn't argue. He only handed her a small pouch. "In case you catch him hungry." She nodded once, saddled the mare, and rode out before noon. The wind bit at her coat. The trail narrowed by dusk, but she didn't slow, not even when snow started falling in thin sheets across the trees. The world went quiet. She rode through it like a ghost chasing something half lost. By the second morning, she saw smoke in the distance, a thin line rising from a clearing near an old, half-collapsed barn. The kind of place you'd pass without notice unless you were trying not to be found. She tied the horse and walked the last half-mile on foot, boots crunching, soft over frost. No sound but the birds and the breath in her lungs. He didn't look up when she stepped into view. James sat on a broken fence rail, hammering a rusted nail into a post that wouldn't hold. His coat was open, his face unreadable. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. Loretta didn't stop. "And you weren't supposed to leave." "I had a reason." She folded her arms. "So do I." Finally he stood. His voice was rough. "You followed me." "Don't flatter yourself," she said. "I came for answers. If you wanted to vanish, you should have picked a direction I couldn't ride." James gave a tired breath. "This isn't about you." "You're right. It's about the man who keeps leaving things behind and calling it protection." He looked away. "You left the store, your name, me, and still you think distance fixes what you broke?" "I left," he said, "because someone from the old days rode into Red Bluff. One of the men from my unit. He's camped not far from here. Said he had business with the name I borrowed." Loretta's throat tightened. "So you ran." "I came to stop something before it reached you." "You don't get to decide what reaches me," she said. "You don't get to make me safe by vanishing." James rubbed the back of his neck. "I've done things, Loretta." "So have I," she shot back. "I've waited. I've believed. I've stayed." His eyes met hers. "He knew I wasn't Michael. Said if I didn't disappear, he'd tell the town, the army, anyone who'd listen. I couldn't let that happen, not again." "Then why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want you to see me like that. I already have." Silence. She stepped closer. "You keep fixing things," she said, voice softer now. "Fences, roofs, people. But you never let anyone fix you." He didn't reply. She reached for the hammer in his hand and took it gently. "I didn't follow you to save you," she said. "I followed you so you'd stop saving me from yourself." James looked at her hands, gloved and steady, then at her face, cold but not closed, and something in him, something rusted, gave way. He sank onto the fence rail again, elbows on knees. "I didn't think you'd come. I shouldn't have had to." He gave a bitter laugh. "You always were braver than me." "No," she said. "I just got tired of waiting for the wrong kind of silence." They stayed like that for a while. The wind shifted. The fire inside the barn crackled faint. Finally, James spoke again. "I don't want to go back to who I was." "Then don't," Loretta said. "Start where you are." He looked up at her. "And if he rides into town anyway? If the truth still reaches us?" "Then we stand still," she said. "We face it, together." He nodded slowly. "You always did say things better than I could. I just use fewer lies." He smiled at that, and for the first time she smiled back. The sun was barely up when they rode into Red Bluff, the horses walking slow, like they understood what it meant to return somewhere different than when you left. The frost hadn't melted from the boardwalks yet, and chimney smoke curled soft above rooftops like threads trying to stitch the town back together. James rode ahead, but Loretta wasn't far behind. He slowed at the edge of Main Street, then stopped altogether. She pulled up beside him, reins steady in her hands. "Looks smaller," he said. "No," she answered. "Just safer." He gave a quiet nod, then kicked his heel and turned toward the store. Curtis stood on the porch of the sheriff's office with a cup of something steaming. He didn't call out, just tipped his hat slow, as if to say welcome back without using the words. When they reached the general store, James dismounted and walked up the steps like a man entering a place for the first time. The door creaked open. Everything was where it had been. Dust settled, shelves leaning a bit more than before, but still standing. Loretta stepped in behind him. She didn't ask permission. James turned slowly, looking at the space. "Do you want to keep it?" She raised a brow. "The dust?" He smiled faintly. "The store?" Loretta smirked. "Well, the dust does seem attached. Might charge it rent." James chuckled. "First customer's already living here then." She glanced around. "Not just as it is." "What then?" She stepped behind the counter, ran a hand along the edge. "A nameplate. 2 of them." James leaned against the wall. "Hart and Lorne?" She nodded. Alphabetical's fair. That evening, James lit the stove for the first time in weeks. The fire took slow, but it took. Loretta scrubbed the front windows while the kettle boiled, and when Curtis passed again near dusk, he found the lights on and a chalkboard out front with 2 words, "Open tomorrow." The next morning, folks came quiet but steady. Miss Heller brought thread. The preacher bought candles. Elsie Meyer brought in a dented tin pot and asked if it could be hammered back into shape, then stayed just long enough to ask Loretta if she had a new apron pattern. By noon, 3 children were sitting on the front steps, shelling peanuts. By sundown, the pie Loretta had baked was down to 1 slice. James watched it all from behind the counter. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it wasn't hesitant anymore. He called people by name. He smiled with his eyes, not just his mouth. And when one of the boys knocked over a tin of buttons, he laughed. Real. From the chest. Not the short kind. A week passed. Then 2. The church bells rang. The school reopened. The trees began to bud green again. On the 3rd Sunday, Loretta stood after service and accepted an invitation to speak at the women's circle. She wasn't sure what to say, so she brought a jar of dried lavender and taught them how to sew it into the hem of a pillowcase, so it would smell like home, even if home kept changing. Afterward, Miss Agnes patted her hand and said, "You've got hands that stitch more than cloth, dear." Loretta smiled and replied, "I had to start with myself." That night, she wrote for the first time in weeks, not to James, not to the past, just to herself. She wrote, "I kept looking for a place to send my heart. Then I realized I could keep it, and if someone wanted to stay near it, they'd have to stay too." She folded the paper, didn't seal it, slipped it into the back of the ledger at the store. Not for safekeeping, just because it belonged there now. The sign went up 2 days later. It wasn't fancy. James carved it by hand and painted it himself. The letters weren't even perfectly straight, but it said everything. The Hart and Lorne General Store people clapped when it was hung. Miss Heller cried. Even Curtis brought a jug of cider to toast the new owners. He placed the jug down with a grunt. "Didn't think you 2 would make it work. But hell, I also didn't think my 3rd wife would stay, and here we are." James stood next to Loretta as the nails went in. When it was done, she whispered, "Still want to leave?" He looked around, at the faces, at her hand on his sleeve. "No," he said. "For once, I want to plant something." In the following days, James began building a back porch. It wasn't fancy, planks, nails, a couple of spare chairs. But Loretta came out every afternoon with tea, and they'd sit under the awning while the wind passed through. Children started calling her Miss Loretta. Men started asking James about prices before arguing them. The store didn't just open, it breathed. And on the first night they locked the door together, James turned to her, a question in his eyes. "You don't have to ask," she said. "I know," he said. "But I want to." She smiled. "Then ask." He looked down, then back up, slow and steady. "Will you stay?" She reached for his hand. "Only if you promise to, too." He nodded, and that was enough. There were no more letters, no more running, no more ghosts and borrowed names. Just 2 people, 1 store, a porch light that burned into the evening, and a sign that squeaked when the wind got high. Some nights they sat in silence. Others they spoke soft about things that didn't matter just to hear each other's voices. The past didn't disappear. It just stopped leading the way. They didn't need a wedding to promise something real. They didn't need to start over, just to stop running. And sometimes healing doesn't look like firelight in poetry. Sometimes it's just a store that opens on time, a porch light that stays on after dark, and someone who stays. What part of their story stayed with you the most? And where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one.